for you, for IFOB. We're so excited to be here in our new space, and we want to thank Mary Dunn with Seth Weber, Tina Gray, and Brett and the tech team. This is the first time we've used this facility, and we're very appreciative. And while we've been doing Zoom for 8 years, when we did it before and we did it at Hudson, people were just looking in and seeing us, but it wasn't interactive. So now we've stepped it up a bit and we're being interactive, and hopefully we will all figure it out. So we haven't met like this with an educational program in over 2 years in person. So it's really great to see everyone. We did do the awards, we did do our social at our next event, but this is the first educational one that was done in person. So, and hi to Zoom people. So I know you're there.
The panel, you'll just have to say got it on the panel.
Oh, there we go.
And I think
like I said, we're figuring out some of the glitches. So we'll be recording this program for later viewing, and we'll send you the copy of the slides to the people who are on Zoom, and the rest of you have a copy there, and we'll follow up with that. So I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Breakwater Group from Morgan Stanley and Maine HR Convention. In a few minutes, and I'll invite Cameron Shorey and James Stevens from the Breakwater Group to say a few words. Unfortunately, Katie Jones from the Maine HR Convention is not able to join us today, as she and her team are busy planning their 26th annual conference held next month. And there's still time to sign up if any of you want to come. Join us and them on Wednesday, May 11th for a special appearance by IFOB family, Jeff Messer from Messer Truck Equipment, and Dottie Chalmers from Chalmers Insurance Group will be on the stage and sharing their stories. So visit mainehrconvention.com for more information. I'd also like to thank our staff, Brooke Stewart here, our Director of Communications and Tech Expert, and Andrea Parker-Michaud. Andrea, you can come back in now. Who is our marketing and sales coordinator. It's really nice. It used to be just me, so it's nice to have staff and others to help. And Evelyn Goulet is our intern from Thomas, and the board. So some of our board members are here. Thank you, Joe and Josh, and any of you else who are here. Thank you so much. Here at the IFOB, we promote, support, and champion the success of family-owned businesses, the backbone of our economy, with education, networking, and other services. And we just decided that on our board retreat last week, so that's our new statement. So this year we're offering over 60 programs, and you may have seen, oh, I don't have one here. You may have seen out front, I have my favorite hierarchy, which shows all the different programs and what are happening. So please come. They're in person, online, and hybrid. Most of the educational programs will be held right here. And you can email us, sign up with Brooke or me, or on our website for more details. All of these programs are for all of your employees, so it's like Doritos, munch all you want. So we just need to know that they're part of your company and they can sign up and come to our programs. Okay, so our upcoming programs here, May 12th, there's a flyer out there for you. It's leadership and leadership development. It'll be the same time frame as we're doing here. It'll be Michelle Wyman and Steve Musica from Lean East. And then the family business panel will be Peter Horsch from Horsch Roofing and Lily Mullen from Springer's Jewelers. And then on Thursday, May 19th, we'll be going to the Woodlands. And we're going to be doing how to dance with inspiration and avoid time management whirlpools. So, and how to be positive. And that one's not going to be recorded. That's an in-person one from 4 to 6 at the Woodlands, where we're going to have fun. Yes?
Yeah, I'm really old.
You can't hear me?
If you could use your outward voice, you should really
I'm sorry, can you not hear me now?
And if we turn this,
Can be muted.
Yeah, you need
if we mute Zoom, then there won't be an echo.
Okay.
The room will pick up all of us.
Okay, is that better?
That is awesome.
And the
Is it on
room,
you?
Sorry, I'm so old.
as long as that
Yep,
panel
it's on
is
mute.
unmuted, everybody at Zoom land should be able to hear everybody, including me.
Do you want to see?
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, she can finish that. I can hear you on Zoom.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
We'd love to have two of you, but it was kind of tough.
We're just figuring it out.
All right,
Lucky
so,
enough to have this wonderful technology.
yeah, all right, so May 12th, come back here for another program. May 19th, come to the Woodlands. We're gonna have fun and do time management. And then nominations are here, okay? So if you know any family-owned businesses, please nominate them. We have some winners in our room here. If you nominate them, they know that you recognize their excellence. And if they're not, they don't need to be members. If they are not members, they get a free membership if they complete the application. And we'll be meeting October 12th at the Holiday Inn by the Bay. We should be on track to have 500 people. And we're having Tony Simmons, the 5th generation retired CEO of Tabasco sauce. And he's never been to Maine. So we're gonna spice it up, although he does have cousins in the Midcoast. So we'll have that.
What was the date on that?
October 12th. So we hadn't had it for 2 years. It used to be in June, but we had to move to October, and then we had to move the scramble, and then we had to move all these things. So that's why we're a little late starting this year, because we shuffled so many different things. So, and we'll have Amanda Hill from New Center, Maine, who's going to be hosting that for us. So check out our website for that. And today we're kicking off our how-to series on succession planning. So how many of you all think you ought to have a succession plan? Raise your hand. Okay, how many of you have one? Oh, good thing you're all here. That's good. So Kevin will give you some information. So Kevin Haley from Brann Isaacson is going to be leading this discussion. We have our panelist, Brett Wickard, founder of Bull Moose Music and Field Stack. And we have Mike Davis, former board member, Industrial Roofing Companies, who's going to talk about their transition. At the end of the program, I will ask you all for your surveys. And now that I can hold you in a room, we'll give you some fabulous door prizes. And you can't Zoom up. People on Zoom, we're going to send you the piece too. But we really, really want your feedback and your input, because that's how we build our programs. So I'll invite Cameron, Shuri, and Jane Stevens to come up and say a few words, and then we'll toss it to Kevin.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you for everyone for coming today. Thank you, speakers. Echo a lot of thank yous Catherine already gave out today. It's really you all in attendance and speakers and people who are donating their time that are able to provide this information to business owners here in Maine that can be really impactful and valuable. For that, we are very proud to sponsor this event, and I really appreciate everyone showing up today.
Yeah, and it's meaningful for us as financial advisors. There's 3 of us on the team. We're also joined by Gary Bergeron as one of the other partners of our Breakwater group. And all 3 of us come from family-owned businesses. And we work pretty heavily with family-owned businesses. So that's why we wanted to support this event, is because we come from it, we kind of get it, and we work in it day to day. So it's an important event, and we're glad to support it.
It's a pleasure. So appreciate everyone coming.
I just have to grab
Yeah,
my
of course.
pen that I left up here. Thank you. We'll go to you.
So Brett, can I share my screen? Is that what I do?
Yes, sir.
I think that worked.
You might want to tilt your laptop up a bit so they can see more.
Oh, I see.
Other way. You can actually shut his video off unless he wants to be seen on camera.
I don't care to be seen.
Up to you, yeah.
Unless people find that distracting. Anyway, I sort of feel like I was standing over there trying to decide what experience this whole setup thing reminds me of. And it reminds me of, I learned to drive a stick on a 1964 GMC potato truck up in Fort Kent. And it was a great old truck, but it was super temperamental, and everything had to be just exactly right. And if one thing was just a little bit off, then probably you were going to stall, or some other really bad thing was going to happen. I kind of feel like that's where we're at on this tech thing. So I don't want to touch anything at this point.
We have 30 people on scene.
Oh, that's great.
Wow, good
That's
on
great. That's a great crowd. And Catherine was telling me this morning, this is the first live educational program since the beginning of the pandemic, and it's a great turnout, and there's some awesome post-pandemic energy in the room that I'm picking up, I think, unless I'm imagining that, which is possible. So my name is Kevin Haley. I'm a partner at the law firm of Brann Isaacson in Lewiston, and I've been there since 1995, so a little while. And my practice is largely corporate and commercial transactional stuff. And a big thing that I've been doing for the last, feels like for the last 4 or 5 years, is helping family-owned companies transition. And there's lots of different ways that that transition can take shape, and lots of different models, and lots of different very specific problems that individual family-owned businesses are trying to figure out a way to solve. There are some common themes. So what we're going to talk about this morning are what those themes are. And we're going to talk about different models for dealing with them. And to kind of drive the conversation, we're going to have sort of a moderated discussion with my 2 colleagues over here, Brett to the far left, to my far left. I went to Bowdoin with Brett, and he started Bull Moose Music when, were you a junior?
That's right.
Yeah, I'll let Brett tell his business story. But what's the reason that Brett is there's lots of reasons he's interesting, but one of the things he brings to this conversation is he has just recently gone through an ESOP with Bull Moose Music, which is a succession planning model. And then so Brett is on the founder side of the conversation. Mike is a successor. Mike and his business partners are successors to the industrial roofing family of companies. And so Mike is going to be bringing that perspective on it. And that model was very different from the ESOP model. So hopefully we'll be able to kind of get it. Brooke will raise her hand on your behalf and we'll read them out loud so everyone can hear them. And then for folks that are in the room, I want you to feel completely comfortable raising your hand or interrupting or jumping to your feet in excitement and sharing whatever question or comment or concern that it is that you might have, because if you've been to a presentation that I've given before, one of my standard lines is that people in the audience would much rather listen to themselves talk than to listen to us talk. And we want to give the opportunity to do that. And we also want to make sure that if you came into the room with a concern or a question about the subject matter, well, we sure want to answer it if we can. So don't be bashful about asking your questions. So I'm going to ask Mike and Brett to tell a little bit of their businesses' stories at the outset and a little bit about themselves. Then I've got some kind of level setting vocabulary and issue-oriented slides, just a handful, I promise. And we're going to go through those slides. And then we're going to have a kind of a moderated conversation among the 3 of us and you. And they had the questions in advance. So they hopefully have had a chance to at least think about some of these themes. And that's the point at which I hope other people who have thoughts to share jump in. So why don't we start with Brett with your story, and then we'll go with Mike, and then we'll go on from there.
Sure. I'm Brett Wickard. I came to Maine to go to Bowdoin College, and after my junior year, I founded Bull Moose, and we really started from nothing. My family had gone bankrupt the summer before I founded Bull Moose, and so I've been living in a trailer park. But as we all know, that starting a business with very little capital is actually, in some ways, an advantage, because you learn to be very, very efficient. So, excuse me. So we managed to leverage that efficiency and grow over the years, and so we became the largest retailer of entertainment goods in northern New England, and I ESOP at the end of this last year.
Great, thanks, Brett. Well, we'll get a lot more detail from him over the course of the next hour or so. How about you, Mike?
My name is Mike Davis. I'm a lifelong Mainer, grew up here, went to school at University of Maine, and actually went through engineering and was with a large international company, and kind of realized that the corporate ladder wasn't going to be for me. And so I went for a different kind of ladder and found a roofing company. But basically, through friends at school, learned and knew this family business. And when they were looking for someone to fit a role within their succession plan, they kind of called on me and a couple of my buddies. Some of them were scared of heights and I wasn't. So I took the opportunity and kind of started earning equity in the business right from the beginning. And that was kind of phase one. And then phase two was the final buyout transition that we just recently completed in January. So that was a 16-year process that just kind of came to conclusion. And then now that I'm the owner with a couple of partners, we got to figure out our succession plan. So even though I'm here speaking about it, we don't have ours defined yet.
Great, thanks, guys. So this first slide, so many of you have heard this, and it's in fact sort of a IFOB.
People want to see the speakers, so we're wondering if we should move the laptop here so they can see the three of you.
Really testing me.
I know. There's a lot of
Okey-dokey.
moving parts, I know.
Tell them to sit tight for a sec.
Deep breath,
We'll
everybody.
move mine. No, leave his. He can look at his notes and I'll set up mine.
Oh, all right.
You tell them to sit tight for a sec.
Midstream audio visual adjustment.
You gotta find my cord.
My father-in-law likes to say that technology is Old Testament God, you know?
Right. Oh, it absolutely is.
Not unforgiving.
Extremely unforgiving.
Smite you.
It just smites you down.
So like, want me to send you this Zoom link? You have it?
Yeah, I can't use this one. I got this one. I gotta back up to my backup. I don't have enough power on my other one. So my cord will be off. Nope, you should be fine. Yeah, I'll put it right there and it should be fine.
So while we're figuring out the tech, we will soon be able to see Mike and Brett's faces on Zoom.
And then folks will quickly say, can we not see?
Can we shut
Seems like a lot of effort. So planning for succession, both Mike and Brett have already alluded to this, but planning for succession is a critical issue for small businesses. Fewer than a third, and you've all heard these statistics before, but fewer than a third of family-owned businesses survive the transition to the second generation, and fewer than 13% of family-owned businesses survive into the third generation. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And one of the issues that we're going to talk about is that there is a certain hitting the lottery aspect to successfully transitioning your business to a younger generation of family member. There are lots of ways to transition a business to people who are not members of your family. In order to transition your business to someone who is a member of your family, lots of things that are not in your control actually have to fall just right. So for example, there has to be another generation. And you know, many of us have kids, but some of us don't. Those kids have to be the right age. So if you're 20 years older than your child, which is certainly within the realm of possibility, you might not be ready to retire before that person needs to sort of do his own thing. It's entirely possible that you might have 4 kids, none of them being interested in doing what it is that you have done. And there's very little that you can do in the end to control that. So lots of variables that we can't control, but there are lots of variables that we can control. And one of the things that Mike was referring to, the process that he has just come through was, what did you say, 17 years in the making? So the sooner you begin the process of thinking about these issues, the closer your business is going to be to being prepared to transition in one of the ways that is available to you. And whether that method ends up being passing the business on to the next generation of your family, or whether that transition is to some non-family member, you're still going to be better prepared if you start thinking about these issues, years and years in advance. But this is the one war story that my wife encouraged me to tell, which is her transition story. She had a long, successful career in the digital advertising business. She had her own company that she owned for about 10 years. She was the only owner. She didn't have any kids that were involved or willing to be involved. She had one very trusted employee. And we had conversations over the years about what a transition might look like. In the end, she was ready to be done working. And so she stopped and she gave a half a dozen of her clients to her trusted employee and turned the lights off, which not exactly a transition success story, because she didn't really extract any value from it, but she was ready to be done working. Now, there's a little bit of an unusual, or not, it's not actually not an unusual scenario, but it's different from probably many of your businesses that it was a pure kind of personal services oriented business. So, unless she was willing to work in the business, it would be hard to get anybody to pay her for that business. And so in a way, transitioning it to a senior trusted employee who's going to take the best clients and continue paying her, a little bit of money, a commission basically over the next few years. That's not an illegitimate way to transition a business like that one if you don't want to work it. It's kind of like being a lawyer, right? The only thing we have to sell is our time, and nobody's really willing to pay us for that. Or at the very least, if we're not willing to put in the time, no one's willing to pay for that. So similar sort of issue there. But if you start having those conversations and thinking those thoughts years and years in advance, then you're going to be in a better position when the time comes when you no longer want to be working. All right. So the central issue for most family-owned businesses is that a high percentage of the family's wealth is represented by the value of this enterprise. And the enterprise itself cannot be used to buy groceries or to make car payments. So trying to convert the wealth that is trapped inside your enterprise into wealth that you can use to fund your retirement or to pay for your grandkids' college or whatever your financial needs are as you start to get older is in many ways the central problem that we're trying to solve here. If there's a way that you can do that results in the business remaining in your family for another generation or 2 generations, then that's great. But ultimately what has to end up happening is you need to figure out a way to get the wealth that's inside the business, outside the business, and be available for the use of the founders. And so that can be a great challenge in the family transition model in particular, if there is not liquidity lying around in order to fund that. So it would be great if you had an independently wealthy child who had all the money in the world and was willing to buy the business from you for cash. That almost never happens. So there has to be some kind of planning process that results in a technique that frees up liquidity to be able to pay out the founders and then have the business continue. And if there isn't a way to do that, then you're probably going to end up with a succession technique that doesn't include passing the business to your family members. You're going to sell it to somebody else who has the capital to pay for it. So that's the challenge that we're all trying to deal with here. Oh, no, you're not going to do that, are you? Oh, we restart tonight. Not restart right now. So succession planning, we've talked about this theme already a couple of times. The successful succession plan is built over years. And I think it's a really useful thing to start thinking about as soon as the business matures, would be the kind of the way that I think about it. So Brett was talking about Bull Moose Music starting off with $20 in his wallet and basically no working capital other than the CDs that he sold yesterday, right? It was CDs, right? Was it CDs and tapes? Was it still tapes?
Yeah.
So,
Tapes are number one.
back in those days. So as soon as the business matures, you get a sense of where the money comes from, what the costs are, what the challenges are from an operational perspective. And that's not too soon to start thinking about, okay, well, let's project ahead 10, 15, 20 years when I don't want to be doing this anymore. And that's particularly true, I think, if an intra-family succession plan is what your objective is, because it takes a long time to grow a child. Important to begin with an open mind. I've talked about this a little bit already. There are, the next slide or two, we're going to talk about 5 different models. I think it's 5 different models for transitioning your business. And it's important in the planning process not to foreclose any of those options, and to explore them and to think about what the pros and cons are and what the reasons are that you might choose one over the other. So if it's really important to you, for either for financial reasons or non-financial reasons to pass the business within the family, then that's great. And you should be thinking hard about what problems you need to solve in order to be able to do that. But it's also instructive in that process to be thinking about, well, what would this look like if I sold to my executive VP? Or what would this look like if I put this on the market and explored selling to a third party? How would those different processes proceed? How would they make me feel? Would they satisfy my objectives, both financial and non-financial? Those are important questions to be asking. And you should be having these conversations with your financial and accounting advisors as well. So the person that's doing your financial plan, your family lawyer, your family accountant, all those people should be involved in that process, because we've all done this more times than you. And so we've seen the train wrecks and we've seen the successful transitions, and we're all there to help you with that. All right, so categories of planning options. And so this is going to kind of drive the conversation in the last 2/3 of the hour here. Transfer to family members. We talked about that. This is IFOB. We're talking about family-owned businesses. So transfer to a family member, category 1 planning options. Transfer to key employees. So that was the model that Mike's group went through. Transfer to a business partner. So not so necessarily a management team member, but if it's you and your brother or you and your uncle, and one wants to exit before the other one, how's that all going to play out? Is the transfer to the other business partner, or maybe there's 2 or 3 business partners, is that something that suits the needs of the enterprise and of the owners? Employee stock ownership plan, that was the model that Brett chose, although Brett's was a little bit unusual, so look forward to hearing him talk about that. And then the one that I think is often it seems silly to say it's often overlooked, but in my planning conversations with lots of small businesses, a sale to an unrelated third party, in a way, is the easiest way to do this. I think a lot of folks undersell the value of their enterprise. Like, why would anyone buy my little business? Well, it probably is. I mean, there are parameters for sure, but like my wife couldn't really sell her business for lots of reasons. But most of the time, there's somebody that's willing to buy your business from you. And that's the beginning of the conversation, obviously not the end of the conversation. How much are they going to sell it for? What are the payment terms? Am I going to have to stay and work for 5 years? All those questions. But that is absolutely an option that you should be thinking about and sort of testing all of these other options against that option. And you may find that it's surprising to you how much more liberating thinking about that option feels than some of the other options. So that kind of feeds back into the keeping an open mind part that we were talking about before. So regardless of what method we're going to approach, there are a handful of issues that arise that need to be grappled with. Again, talking about transitioning to another family member, your specific family dynamics become a really important part of that. And they're actually a really important part of this, almost regardless of which method you choose. So obviously, if your plan is to transition your business to your daughter, and you also have 2 sons, and they don't factor into the plan, okay, you got to deal with that. You got to figure out how you address that issue. That could be hurt feelings. If maybe it's fine, and I've had lots of clients where there was one kid that was heavily involved in the business, and the other kids were not, and they didn't want to be, and that's fine. So then the issue is, well, okay, that's great. So we're transitioning this really large part of the family's wealth to Susie, and Pete and Tom are over here. Well, how do we take care of Pete and Tom? So because that is an important family dynamic to address, right? So if the business is worth $40 million and it's going to Susie, okay, well, what happens to Pete and Tom? So that's the kind of issue that you have to grapple with. And it's also, we were talking about this on our prep call the other day. It's sort of the perfect storm of all kinds of things that old-fashioned Yankee households hate to talk about and avoid talking about at all costs, right? It's how do you feel? What are your emotions? How about money? Let's talk about who gets how much money. All of these issues that I'm joking about the New England thing, but nobody likes to talk. No families like to talk about these things. But to successfully navigate this, you have to talk about these things, and it's even more important to talk about them before any decisions are made. Because if that conversation is, all right, what were the boys' names? Pete and Tom in my hypothetical? All right, Pete and Tom, here's the thing. Susie's getting the business. You're getting Buckus. You okay with that? We're closing next week. That's not a good place to be in that conversation, right? So family dynamics, sources of financing related to that. Where's the money going to come from? Is it an ESOP? Is it a sale to a third party that's going to pay cash? If it's going to the kids, how are they going to pay for it? Tax planning. If there is a gratuitous aspect to what you're doing, if you're transitioning the business to one of your kids or multiples of your kids, how does that play in from an estate planning perspective? What are the transfer tax implications of that? How much is the business worth? How does it fit into your overall estate plan? And then also tax planning from an income tax perspective, because, and there's a bunch of accountants in the room, I'm sure, there are ways you can really screw this up. And by that, I mean ending up with a much larger tax bill than you needed to have. And so that's a terrible outcome. I mean, at the end of the day, we all have to pay our income taxes, and that's fine. But there's no point structuring a deal in a way that causes you to incur more tax exposure than is necessary. So tax planning is an important part. And then operations, and this is one that I think sometimes gets overlooked. How is this business going to function on a post-succession basis? What is the founder's role going to be? Are there folks in place that have the skills that are necessary to continue operating the business in a profitable way? So those are all things that need to be thought about. We talked about the family dynamics earlier in the process. Family members interested in Able, did they grow up in the business, or are they coming home to be in the business? All of those things have different dynamics. And then an especially important one to think about, do they have the skills to lead non-family member executives? In the end, that's why the 10-year, 15-year planning horizon becomes so important, because you want to talk about operational challenges. Having Junior come home from California to take the president's spot while there's a senior executive that has been there for 25 years who all of a sudden is now reporting to someone who's 20 years younger than him or her. Hey, that's tough. That's a tough one. You gotta think about that and figure out how you're going to address that. Financing issues we talked about. I think we've talked about all of these things. Gratuitous transfer, gift to kids. commercial financing, which could be at play in an ESOP, it could be at play in a management buyout, all those things. Private investment, you're going to bring in an investor from the outside who's going to invest in the business and use that liquidity to cash out some or all of the owner's interest. And then owner financing. I mean, and that happens. That's probably the most common technique is the founding generation or the generation that is transitioning has to be willing to accept some investment risk associated with it and get their money over time. I mean, it's good to get comfortable with the concept that you're going to end up doing something like that because that's a really common thing that ends up happening. Talk about the tax planning issues as far as gifted estate and income tax planning. So we won't spend much more time on that one. Operational challenges, we've talked through all these bullet points as well. Last little kind of vocabulary component of it, and then we'll let these guys talk. There's lots of different flavors of ESOPs, and Brett's flavor is actually a little bit different than the conventional flavor, and he'll talk about that in a minute. But in general, you form what amounts to a retirement plan, an ESOP trust. The company borrows money from probably a specialized ESOP lender. There are banks that are really heavily into financing ESOPs and do this all the time. So the company borrows money from a commercial lender to fund the ESOP trust. The ESOP trust buys some or all, or beginning with some and eventually all of the stock of the founding members or all the shareholders, and then the company pays back the loan from operating revenues. I mean, that's the model in a nutshell. Different ways to finance it, and lots of different ways to slice and dice it, but that's the idea. Couple things to keep in mind on ESOPs is that they have a couple of near magical tax attributes, and they're magical only because Congress in its largesse decided to make them magical. So a C Corp can make tax deductible contributions to an ESOP trust to pay down the principal on the ESOP note. That might be a unique scenario where principal payments can be made with tax deductible dollars. And then if properly structured, an S Corp that owns 100% of the shares of a business can avoid income taxation entirely, which is a pretty remarkable tax outcome. So worth thinking about those things. We don't have to get into all the details of the tax stuff, but there's some things that make it worth kicking the tires on that. So that's the end of the slide. So what we're going to do next is I have this cheat sheet of questions that none of you have, but that the three of us have, and we're going to kind of walk through some of the issues that we talked about during the slides and get Mike and Brett's perspective on those different things. So I guess what I'd like to maybe start with Brett and just ask you to kind of walk us through, you know, without using real numbers or anything like that, but sort of walk us through your ESOP planning process and what drove that and why you chose to do that and how it was structured.
Sure. Well, look at that. Yeah, so when I considered kind of the next chapter for Bull Moose, the first step I went through was really, what did I want? Like, why did I found the business originally? And kind of before all the financial stuff, I really found that the emotional stuff or the kind of psychological stuff was more impactful to really think about what you want as the next chapter. And so in deciding on an ESOP, there are a couple things that really hit home to me, which was I found a Bull Moose. I love the way music connects people, and like I love the community aspect of our stores. And an ESOP, by having the people in the stores own the store, seemed to kind of take that community journey even a step further. And so it kind of was a continuation of my dream and originally starting it. So that really resonated. And another thing really impacted me was I thought ESOPs, and this was Kevin had a slide that said keep an open mind when you think about this stuff. And I will confess, I originally thought ESOPs were loser companies, where the ways that people are just said, oh, we've got nothing better to do, we'll just sell to the employees. And I found a research study in the Harvard Business Review that showed that not only are ESOPs not loser companies, they actually outperform their non-ESOP competitors. And when I looked at the tax benefits and everything, I realized that our team could have an incredible advantage, like the tax ramifications that Kevin pointed to right there. Like if I had ESOP Bull Moose 10 years ago, like literally it would have had a gigantic impact on our operating capital and everything. I mean, it would be a huge win. So, kind of feeling those check boxes said, ESOPs also have that kind of flexibility too of there's a lot of different ways you can go about it. We chose 100% ESOP, which means I literally own 0% of Bull Moose now. The employees, literally the trust owns 100% of it. And the sub S thing that Kevin pointed to is true for Bull Moose, which is, it's completely tax sheltered at that point. And yeah, so it's been a really fun process, but I'll say that the non-financial side is much larger part of the process than what I thought going into it.
Great. So are you still involved at all in the operations of it, or how did that part work?
Yeah, it's as of next Monday, I will have no formal title at Bull Moose anymore, so I'm out of there. But no, kidding aside, about 10 years ago when I founded FieldStack, I had started transitioning Bull Moose from an operational perspective. So I had a director of operations who ran all day-to-day operations, and I really didn't have a huge involvement in the day-to-day of it. But when we ESOPed, I kept the title interim CEO, but just as a way to make sure that folks knew that there'd be stability, that we would keep operating the way. That's one thing. One other thing I'd like to say that I liked about an ESOP is a very smooth way to just keep operating the way you're operating. Like we didn't have to, there wasn't some dramatic change that, oh, on Monday, now we have to do X, Y, Z instead. We kept operating the way we were operating. But so, I'm still on the board of directors, but having set up the kind of operational decisions made over the years, I was already out of the day-to-day. But it's a later question of yours, but you say operations is a challenge. Even though you think you're out of the day-to-day, I will say one opportunity for FieldStack that I'm doing that I did not do with Bull Moose is there are tons of things we all do that we're the only person in our company that do them. So like, and you don't think about it as you're doing it. You're like, oh, I know our Waterville landlord for 23 years. So I just hang out with them and I negotiate a different way because we all literally know each other. We've grown up together. I'd never brought anybody along on those negotiations. And I don't do that at all anymore. Anytime I'm doing something alone, I have to ask myself, would it be better to have somebody that I'm mentoring along that process? And that is the, I would say the main challenges for Bull Moose are all things like that. You're like, oh wait, I was the only person who ever did that. And it only comes up every couple of years.
Yeah, that's a great point. So that's a good segue to bring Mike into the conversation. So in your opening spiel, you talked about this process starting 17 years ago. And so put a little bit of flesh on those bones, and then coming into this family business, having not had any background in the roofing business, talk a little bit about what, how John and Rick brought you into the operational, taught you this business going back 17 years.
Yeah, to give them a lot of credit, it really started before me, right? So say 20 years ago, they knew that, it's really a people business and they needed to find and develop a team to take over the company someday. They weren't interested in, a big roll up or a private equity thing. They were third generation and they wanted to pass it along to key employees, but really take care of all of their employees. And at the time, I don't think ESOPs probably even existed. So they were looking for that key new leadership team. And, our business is, we all have the same challenges, but roofing is, a pretty dynamic business. Bad things can happen when roofs blow off or when you don't do it right. So it's a very risky business, safety wise and financially. and takes a lot of really hard work. So their focus was people, who's going to take this over. And they looked at their family, and there was like one of my partners is a family member, kind of like I call it fourth generation. And then there's three of us that are partners that are non-family. And we're the first non-family owners of this family business. So we're kind of like fourth generation, just finishing a 20-year succession plan. And when I started in my late 20s, I thought I was ready to run the company like right away. Let's just do this deal, I'm good to go. And here I am now 20 years or 17 years later, realizing I still don't know a lot. And so I give them a ton of credit for that long-term strategy. And they focused on people first, but then we had the conversation of other factors, such as financial and time, and spent obviously a lot of time figuring those things out.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And so can you just sort of build out the bones of what happened, like what the transaction was? Because the fact that John and Rick kind of had their own pieces, that's an interesting aspect of it.
So they were third generation, and they had sort of decided that they were going to kind of do their own thing as two brothers, and sort of almost had split the company. And they kind of had different goals of what they wanted to do. And as they were setting those paths, they realized they had some missing spots on the team. So that's where I came in. And I always wanted to be an owner. And I sort of said, I want equity right from the beginning. And we negotiated that. In lieu of compensation, I earned equity, and me and some others did too, where we said, we're going to meet these certain goals, we'll meet growth goals or what have you, and we'll earn equity along the way in lieu of compensation, basically. And we call that phase one. And that process took almost 10 years. And we earned a pretty substantial piece of the business. After that, I call it phase two, which was the interim phase. And that was undefined. So we were no longer earning equity. It was sort of set. And we were just operating as partners. But we had, founders and majority partners and minority partners. And obviously there's a lot of dynamics that go along with that. And then as phase two went on, we eventually had to figure out phase three. And I like to say that really started with, all parties kind of the energy being ready to go. We really were anxious to take it to the next step. I think the Rick and John were kind of ready to think about their next phases. And so, but it was an awkward stage. And really the pivotal moment for us was a conversation. And it really, this whole thing comes down to communication. As Kevin was alluding to, it's an awkward conversation, but it's one that I would encourage you to just go for it. It's not as complicated as you think. And I boil it down to who, what, when, where, and how. And the how is some of the things that you just talked about. And obviously the who is, like in my case, our team. But there's also the goals of like the sellers and the buyers, and it's financial, right? Like what's your number? What do you want to walk away? And that can vary very dramatically for different people. But you got to start somewhere, and you got to start putting those things in, and they might not even know yet, right? So you got those 5 boxes that you're trying to figure out, and even answering one is better than none, right? So you might be able to say, okay, we know the who now, or that's the most important thing, and we got to develop those people. Then there's the what, and there's the number to walk away, and there's also pay along the way, right? Like they might need to make $1 million a year for the next 5 years before they can even think about it. So, but getting those things out there is much more healthy than not. Yeah. And that's what happened with us. Once we started to find those, and that process took about 3 years to start answering all those questions. And then once we had that figured out, that's when we really started to bring in the advisors. And then that took about 2 years.
Yeah. It was the transaction. I remember I was drafting the first transaction documents on the first weekend of March Madness in last year in 2021, and it was a year-end close. So it was a long process. So Mike, you got your point about how much? And I don't think this was on the list, but I think it's an important question to ask, and it's really important in the ESOP context as well. This question of what a business is worth is such a difficult question. I mean, it's difficult technically because there's a bunch of different ways to value a business, and it's also difficult for a closely held business kind of, I hate to use the word emotionally, but let's just put it this way. There are lots of non-financial aspects of how much a business is worth that you have to contend with if you're trying to have the conversation that Mike was just describing. So the question for each of you guys is, and I suspect the answer will be a little bit different, but how did you approach that issue about, okay, we're going to buy you out. How much are we going to buy you out for? And I want you to tell us obviously what the purchase price was, but how that conversation happened, I think could be instructive, because that conversation, like you were saying, that conversation has to happen. And it has to happen kind of at the beginning of this process, not at the end of this process, because if the number you need to get is 40 million bucks, well, that's a lot different than if the number you need to get is 5 million bucks. And it could be the same business using two different methodologies could have both of those valuations. It all depends on what your methodology is and why you're attempting to arrive at the value. So it's really a complicated. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking because I want you to answer that question, and then I want you to answer that question. Like, what was the process in the ESOP, and whether that was, you may not know this, but if you have the insight in terms of how it might have been different if you'd gone to State Street Bank to borrow the money. And so we can talk about that a little bit. So Mike, why don't you go first, and then we'll let Brett go.
Well, when we had that conversation a few years ago, we didn't know what the seller's goals were, right? And there was actually two of them, and I think they were different. So we had that dynamic. But in general, getting a ballpark objective was a healthy thing, because it's like anything. If you don't have a goal, you're going to get there. When we defined a ballpark, at the time I was like, well, that's a stretch. But there are variables, right? Like, if you're an owner of a company and you're paying yourself a super high salary, then the earnings afterwards times some multiple gives you a lower value, because you're taking out a lot of money from compensation. But if you reduce your compensation and boost income times that multiple, then the value of the enterprise is worth more, right? So you've got some simple variables like that alone. You could just change kind of what you're paying yourself and boost your earnings and make the company worth more, right? So you get a check at the end of the day as opposed to along the way. But when we had that conversation, we kind of figured out those ballparks, and it meant, okay, now we know what we're shooting for. And we're partners anyway. So we were like, okay, so we got to increase earnings a little bit more, and we got to, retain earnings in the company, because for us, the health of the company was paramount. I give them a lot of credit, and I learned a lot from them to always put the company first. Because if you don't put the company first, if the company's not healthy, then this is not going to work, right? The best thing that you can do is have a healthy company. And with that, it will allow this to happen. So those things started to fall in line, like, okay, we need to retain more earnings. We need to, focus on improving profitability a little bit more and get that value to that level. And then also have belief that cash flow will be consistent so that we can, pay for it. And that's kind of what happened. And when we first heard the numbers or the targets, I was like, I don't think that's possible. But then we set goals and we achieved those goals, and in fact exceeded them. So the transition was actually easier when it happened than when we first started that conversation. But it was a result of having the conversation and setting those goals.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And one of the issues that jumps out at me from the way you kind of position that is that, and I have this conversation when I give talks on contract negotiations. I'm always talking about like how you find leverage in a contract negotiation. And one of the ways to find leverage in a contract negotiation is to make time your friend and not your enemy. And same is very much true for this exercise. If time is your friend, then you can toggle those switches, and you can manipulate the the cash flow of the business and you have time to build value and grow the company and grow revenue. If time is your enemy, then you're just up against it, and you're just, you know, then you have far fewer options. Yeah.
So I just had a question on that. You said that you far exceeded it. So I'm just curious with the owners, was your purchase price set at that point, or were you renegotiating what the purchase was going to be as you were making the changes?
For the most part, that ballpark remained. There's still some seller financing involved in our company. And so when I say we exceeded it, we were able to keep more money in the company than I expected, as well as pay down more than I expected. But the overall ballpark was the same. But the company is in a healthier position than what I anticipated. And the nice thing about them as sellers is they were never going to take too much. But, you know, we've had a very strong economy and things have gone well. And so we're even kind of better than what was expected.
Good question, Jen. What a very lawyerly question.
Of course.
Brett, talk us through the valuation exercise for the ESOP. How did you come up with a number?
Yeah, I found that part really interesting, frankly. ESOPs have a lot of structure around them. So during the ESOP process, a trustee was appointed, like we chose a trustee, and they hire a business valuation expert. And that business valuation expert is using standard business valuation, strategies like multiples of EBITDA and things like that. One thing that will hurt every seller's head during the process is they discount it because it's a private sale. So whatever number it comes out with, they slice a little bit off of it, and you're like, ouch, no one loves that. But I thought it was a reasonable process, and an ESOP is a unique transaction in some ways in that my own goal was I didn't want the value to be too high. Like I wanted to make sure that it's the right value. So our employee owners are given like a fair, straightforward shot. So ESOPs have an additional level too. They have a fairness opinion that's happens after the valuation, just to try to make sure that all of these aspects are fair and reasonable. And I think part of the reason that happens too is early on, I was pushing for a lower valuation to kind of give everybody a head start and crank, and you can't in an ESOP because there are tax advantages if you got a lower than expected valuation, because you could in effect have your gains be put in a Roth IRA and have them go tax-free. And so,
Right.
So there's a lot of moving parts with that, but I found it overall to be interesting, but a lot like selling your house, like when you sell your house, you're like, oh, it's, I'm better than the neighbor's house. It's got to be worth 20 grand more than that. But
Yeah, that's that process of being both open-minded, but also kind of clinical about the valuation exercise is I think really important, and it's something that all businesses are different, office, but a lot of my small business clients don't think about their businesses from a sort of enterprise value perspective. They whether it's the point that Mike was making about, well, it's really their income, like so they've got a business that throws off X number of dollars of cash, whatever they don't need to have in the company for a working capital, they pull out. And that's almost sort of like a partnership model where they're not managing the business from an enterprise value, kind of balance sheet perspective. They're managing it from last year was a good year because I pulled 600 grand out of the business, right? Which is completely legitimate. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you're thinking about this transition issue, and there's lots of personal tax reasons and financial planning reasons why you'll have accountants and financial advisors telling you should take more money out of your business, right? That's nothing wrong with that. But if you're thinking about this process, this succession planning process, think about valuing your business the way a third-party buyer would value your business. And if there are things that are happening in your business that you can manage to improve that outcome, then at least think about those. And that's kind of like what Mike was talking about. It's like, okay, well, we can grow the business. We can take a little bit less out, and the business is going to look like it's worth more, because it is in a way. Yeah.
So you just about touched on it. Did either one of you seek a third-party potential buyer? That's one question. So did you go to a third party to get what someone from the outside would actually pay for this business? Then two, the people yourself, when you look at from a family planning perspective, are you in a position where you said, I don't really need to optimize my valuation because my estate is such that I don't need to build it up, so the third party is really not involved?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we didn't seriously consider a third party, but knew that we would get a higher valuation from a third party. And I think that's true in a lot of these cases. Kevin addressed it early on in the slide that a lot of people ignore that option. And I think that would have been financially likely a better end result for Bull Moose, but it wouldn't be a better end result for what we really wanted, which was a great next chapter and why I started the business originally. But you're right that I think for folks to get at least dip their toe in that water would make a lot of sense. That market is much more vibrant than what you think about when you're just operating your business on a daily basis. Like there are a lot of folks who want to buy your business.
So your estate, so part two of my question was, so your estate is in a position where you didn't need to optimize the sale of your business.
That's accurate. Yeah.
In our case, I don't think the sellers spent much time on that. They were aware of the market, and in our industry is sort of changed. Like, 10 years ago, who the heck would ever want to own a roofing company? And I think that's changed. People are starting to realize that it's, as is the case with a lot of trades, people are realizing there's more value there. And so the multiples have improved. But it brought really more back, instead of shopping to the market, it was the appraisal process. And we stumbled a bit through that, but I can't underestimate enough that try to get the emotions out of it and have someone that, independent appraiser tell you what it's worth. You're so much better off to just know, whether you're the buyer or the seller. It gives you that path. And then from there, it can give you the roadmap to achieve the goal that you're trying to get to. Like, why isn't it worth this much more? I thought just because you think it's, because we all probably thought, it's worth more than maybe it is in some cases. And to have that true appraisal, it'll then give you the roadmap to get there, because third-party buyers are really smart, right? Especially the bigger the number gets, they get smarter, and they're going to use the same tool. They're going to use these multiples and comps and, all these things. So why not have that as your textbook and then use it, from there?
Yeah. Does that get to your question? Yeah. So I think that's a great, I was talking a minute ago about thinking about how you would value your business and bringing some discipline to that process and attempting to do it through the eyes of a third party purchaser. I think that actually is probably true, not just in terms of enterprise value, but operationally as well. I mean, I think it is a useful exercise to go through the process of operating your business as though you were going to sell it to a third party, or at least thinking about how you would operate it differently if you were entering the process of selling it to a third party. Because I think that introduces the opportunity to improve the financial performance of the business, I think, in lots of instances. But it also helps you kind of highlight kind of what Brett was talking about. If there are processes in your business that live only in your head and nobody else knows what they are, if you're gonna do some kind of an audit of your business risk, If you're gonna hire Barry Dunn to come in and do that for you, that would be a business risk. That the founder carries around half of the know-how that's necessary to operate the business in his or her head, and nobody else knows how to do it. Okay, well, you fix that problem, right? That's a problem you need to fix.
Sorry, just triggered a thought. Specifically, Mike, the owner financing portion of the business, how much of that owner financing was it relative to the overall sale? Was it 50%, 20%? And you guys had to come up with the balance for conventional financing?
It was, I would say, less than 50%. In our case, it's a little different because we were already partners, right? So if the company was worth, just pick a number, $1 million, it wasn't though the seller had $1 million. They only had their percentage of that, right? And then from that was split again, right? So when you really look at it, it was almost like less than a quarter by the
Your
time.
total debt, how much of the total debt was owner financed?
It was, I'd say roughly half, yeah. And it worked out such that, you know, they're like our payments to them are less than their compensation was. So it from a long-term strategy and a cash flow and a strain on the company, it's really not even a big hiccup. We're able to really, and we also operate very conservative, like we have no other debt, and we keep a significant amount of working capital in the business because of fluctuations. You could have a bad job or materials, you know, supply chain challenges. So again, a ton of credit to them to understand that, putting the company first, and then just putting a little bit of leverage there to help them achieve their goal.
I mean, realizing that every kind of business is different, so there's no, one answer. What as a percentage of, let's say, annual sales, annual revenue, is the working capital that you try to keep in the business year after year?
For us, we shoot for 10% of our revenues to keep in
10% of
cash.
revenue just sits there as working capital.
Yeah.
Is it different for you guys at Volvos?
Yeah, it's different because so much of our is vendor finance, like terms on all of the goods within the stores. So I would say slightly lower than that.
Oh, a point that just kind of emerged from that most recent exchange, so it was one of the questions that I had on the list, has to do with sort of where the businesses were. And Mike, I think we're just getting at this, but where the businesses were from a one way to think about it is from a liquidity standpoint, but another way to think about it is from a sort of P&L perspective. Like, I'm guessing that both of these businesses threw off plenty of cash to be able to service the debt that was incurred in order to fund the transition. But was that something that you specifically managed to, or is that just a byproduct of the fact that you managed the businesses well?
Of the actual transaction itself, it's something that you choose as you're setting up the ESOP. So you are trying to figure out what the cash demands of the business are going to be. And there's a lot of freedom of, how much is going to be seller finance, how much would be bank debt, things like that, and what the repayment schedules look like. So it was a really big deal to me to make sure that there was plenty of cash during the transition for the new employee owners, because as a founder, and as we all know, like when you don't have money, that's all you think about. And I didn't want them to be going through that. And yeah, so there's a whole spectrum that you can go with. And one other thing I'd say that did hold true about an ESOP is I found it tough to believe that banks would be interested in loaning money to an entity that has a neutral as zero net worth when it originally is formed. And the folks involved in the ESOPs are like, no, banks love ESOPs because, the employees are all in, you've got stable earnings over time. And that's proven to be true. I mean, there have been a number of banks that reached out to us, and if the new employee owners wanted other sources of capital, they're out there. So that's been a positive end result.
Yeah. Just following up on that,
Did your employees have to personally guarantee any bank debt?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so the way an ESOP is set up is they have, there's no risk on the employees whatsoever. So an ESOP trust is actually what owns it. So there's literally no risk, no guarantee, no capital outlay or anything for the employees. It literally is, when you start it neutral with that, they can only win.
Yeah, it's the ESOP trust is essentially a retirement plan. So the employees don't, the employees occupy a relationship relative to the ESOP trust that's similar to the relationship that we all have to our 401ks or our IRAs. It's an
ERISA.
Yeah, it's a retirement. It's an ERISA benefit plan that has only one asset, which is the stock of their employer. I mean, I might have some cash too, but that's basically what it is. Jack, yeah.
Still on the ESOP question, you mentioned that, you know, how the appraisal was done. And I'm just curious, because one of the things when you're looking at ESOPs is there's definitely a cost to doing it.
Yeah.
And that really concerns some business owners. And I was just curious, at what point you did the appraisal so that you knew as a seller that if that number was going to work for you? So like, how far are you into the process and outlay of costs before you know whether that number is going to work for you?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Actually, let's hit the pause button
Pardon me.
because Jen just wandered into the exact next thing I wanted to ask you about.
Well done.
So I'm gonna take her question, but I'm gonna take it a step further. So answer Jen's question, but then for both of you, order of magnitude, don't have to necessarily use real numbers, but what professionals did you end up involving in this process, and what were transaction costs like? Like, you don't have to tell us it was $8 million, but like, what did that look like from each business's perspective?
About 5 minutes.
Okay,
To answer
yeah,
that
so
question. and then-
that might be the end. That might be the last question.
Yeah, we're gonna have the same. We'll have the same.
Yeah. So early on in the ESOP process, the firm that we went with did their own estimate of what they believed your value would be. And at that point, and I'll use numbers, I feel comfortable saying them, you're in about 50 grand at that point. And so they're not going to give you, they can't promise you because they're not the appraiser or the valuation expert, but they can tell you pretty close. And that did hold to be true. And that all in for us, the ESOP was a little shy of 300,000 transaction.
How about you, Mike?
It was not that big a number, but it was into the six figures for us. And we had again, kind of two sellers with a few different companies and a few partners and you know, it was a fairly complicated transaction, but we were also into the six-figure range.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So order of magnitude, there's an investment associated with that. Yeah.
When you're thinking about ESOP in terms of transitioning employees, whether family or non-family, do they have a rollover or a payout of that similar to a 401k if they were to leave your company after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? Just how does that work?
Yeah, it's written into the ESOP structure too. So there's a range in which that you can operate. So there's a couple things you can do there too is there is payout periods. Some are compliant, so you have to do within a certain level, you have to do it, but then there's a range that you get to select. And then also there are things that you can do to say how people earn ownership interest. So like we decided to balance both seniority and pay. So some folks do it just based on pay every year. Some folks do it based on how long they've worked at the operation. And then you also have the ability to accelerate ownership of some folks when you do the original transaction. And so that's a way that you can, you know, take care of some folks who you might have made the business what it is and grown it. We love that aspect of it.
How are we doing, Catherine?
Okay, so we've sent the surveys around. If anybody needs any pens, I have them here. You can drop your cards here if you have them for the door prizes, but we can still go, you get 8 minutes.
Oh, okay.
How's that?
Oh, that's fine.
And do you have questions from the?
No questions, but a few comments. A
couple people said, great program so far. Also, Lindsay says, well said, Mike, back on the communication part. If you don't start talking about it, it's way more awkward than.
I just have a quick question for Mike. You said you started the process about 20 years ago, you and your 3 other partners. I'm just wondering, so you have John Rick who owned it. If you had any problems convincing them it's time? You know, like, I didn't know if it was something where one of them was gonna hold out till they're 90 years old.
It probably depends on who you ask. But we definitely, there was some pressure there that you start to apply, like we started to be ready. The biggest, I'd say the most frustrating part for us was that stretch where we just didn't know, right? Because we didn't know if it was gonna be 2 years or 10 more years, right? And we were at that kind of point where we were really energized and we just wanted to know more than we did. So that was probably the pressure, but the reality was, I mean, I can literally still see the whiteboard in the room when we had the meeting. We started to write these things out and just ask, like, what about this? What about this? What about this? And like, one of the big things for the sellers was believing that the company was ready. That was actually probably their most important thing. You might think it was the money. It wasn't, it was that. And so we spent a lot of time like, okay, what do you think we need? And there were some key roles that we needed to develop, and there's some people that we needed to develop and things like that. So that became a very healthy exercise. Yeah. And then it also helped us focus on the balance sheet as well. And that was that.
There's a
Another question from someone on Zoom. Any bumps in the road to your eventual long-term plan?
You mean from this point forward, maybe?
Any bumps in the road to your eventual plan?
Eventual plan, we can't hear.
Yeah, eventual plan.
Let me reframe that, because that actually was a question I was just gonna ask, is what was the biggest hurdle? And maybe it was the seller's readiness, but what, for each of you, of this list of issues that we've talked about, what was the biggest hurdle or obstacle to getting this done?
I'll answer a different question.
Okay.
Unexpected stuff. So you've heard how long it took us and all that, but then there's a little stuff, like, what about their cell phones? Right? They used to be, they no longer work here, but they've had a cell phone for their whole life that was paid for by the company. And they gotta go to the Verizon store for the first time in their life and get a cell phone, you know? And that was unanticipated. Or buying a truck, right? Like, you've always had your truck owned by the company. And now you gotta go to a dealership as just a regular person and buy a truck. You know, things like that were not really anticipated. And I didn't have to deal with them, but I know the guys did. And that was unanticipated.
Yeah.
I would concur with that. There are all these little tiny things. So like, all of the deals, all of your leases now have to be to a different entity, and all of these things that you did over the course of, in our case, over 33 years, you're like, whoo, we're doing this over the course of 2 months. And again, they're not financially significant, but you're just like, oh, seriously? I got to negotiate with the, toothpick vendor, and, because the big vendors, of course, are rational about it. But that little vendor you talk to once every 7 years, like, well, this is a different entity. We now need to, you're like, okay.
Yeah, and a lot of those details are, these are actual mechanical details that come up when you're, lawyers talk about when the transaction closes. These are the things that go on your checklist. But that aspect of it really is like selling a business to a third party. You've got all of these kind of due diligence-y things that you need to figure out and make a plan for. Yeah.
As financial advisors, what we see, one of the biggest challenges for business owners selling their businesses, and you may have just hit on it, is really figuring out all those little things that the business paid for. So when they sit down and they're going through their spending analysis, what does it take for them to be financially independent? There's so many things, whether it's, heating their homes, right, paying for their cars, their cell phones, their health insurance, all those different things. Yeah. And it can be really eye-opening. Going through the process of making sure that when you are selling your business, that you're getting enough for it so that you can live the lifestyle that you want to live.
And I think that kind of goes to my point I made maybe 15 or 20 minutes ago about trying to look at your business and at the finances of your business through the eyes of a would-be third-party buyer, because they're going to see those things, you know, in your QuickBooks and be like, "What are we paying for your oil?" Right? I mean, that's, so your business actually is introducing that level of discipline into the way you think about your business it becomes a way of operating your business and ultimately makes these transitions easier regardless of technique.
Okay,
We done?
we have one quick
more.
question.
All right.
At what point did you feel ready to share with employees the plan, and how did you share it?
In our case, it was sort of known who, you know, because we had earned equity along the way, we were already kind of like partners. But we pretty much came to terms like that. We had the handshake deal done. And that was the point that we said, okay, the transition is going to happen in the next 6 months. And we started talking about it. But for us, it was very important to really spread the story that the company's healthy and, you know, the team that you know is still going to be in place. And we've, you know, retention and taking care of our team is very important. So we wanted to do it fairly soon.
Yeah, on our front, I took the advice of the experts who'd done ESOPs before, and I really fought it at first. I wanted to tell everybody day one, and the advice I got was very, very clear. It said, do not announce until it is certain, because things can happen along the way and that you cannot unring that bell. So you can tell kind of your senior team that you're going down this road, and they'll understand. They'll say, look, something could happen, like the valuation could come in wrong or something, and it could derail it, but don't announce to the whole team until you are absolutely certain. So we set up a two-pronged setup. So we announced internally and made a presentation for everybody, and that was fantastic to kind of have the close circle know what's going on. And then they prepped kind of a marketing engine. Because part of an ESOP is to change the culture of the company. So set up our marketing engine to prepare for an internal announcement. So the moment it was definitive, we closed the stores early and kind of did a company-wide celebration.
Great.
Okay, so thank you all very, very much. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for our sponsors. I have 3 door prizes. Anybody need to get their cards in here before we start? All right, you want to do the honor?
Sure.
The first one, thank you, Mike, for providing the door prizes.
Yeah, that's great.
That is Chris Kovac.
Thank you.